This is Matt Renner reporting for TruthOut.org. Today I'm in Silver Spring, Maryland at Winter Soldier, the largest ever gathering of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who will be testifying about their experiences during wartime.
Winter Soldier, Iraq and Afghanistan represents our largest event to date, and we've organized this event because we believe that as we enter the 6th year of this occupation, the voices of veterans and service members, as well as civilians on the ground, need to be heard by the American people and by the people of the world, and also by other people in the military and other veterans, so they can find their voice to tell their story, because each of our individual stories is crucially important and needs to be heard if people are to understand the reality and the true human cost of war and occupation.
Perry O'Brien served with the Army's 82nd Airborne Division in Afghanistan and is a coordinator for Winter Soldier. Perry, thank you very much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The first Winter Soldier was held during the Vietnam War. Why did Vietnam veterans decide to hold a Winter Soldier?
Well, the first Winter Soldier was following the My Lai massacre in '68. And there was a lot of discussion at the time that what you heard a lot in the popular media and coming from politicians and the military leadership was that this was the result of a few bad apples, of an individual unit, of Lieutenant Calley, of, that it was just individual misguided soldiers rather than the result of broader policy. And so what my understanding anyway is that VVAW at the time was trying to address that and to say, no, look, this is much more widespread, this is much more prolific.
And
this isn't
VVAW
Vietnam Veterans Against the War.
Right. So what was the first Winter Soldier?
Well, the first Winter Soldier brought together over 100 Vietnam veterans in the lobby of a hotel in Detroit to testify about violations of international law that they had either witnessed or participated in. And again, it was sort of directly confronting this sort of mythology of the bad apple as war criminal rather than a war itself, which is criminal.
What inspired you to hold a Winter Soldier for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans?
Well, I mean, there's certainly the same discourse. I mean, it's really similar following Haditha, Fallujah, these sort of similar atrocities that we're hearing about.
Abu Ghraib.
Abu Ghraib, of course. Again, bad apples. These are individual soldiers who are not well trained, who, during Abu Ghraib, there was all this talk of, these are guys who weren't all that great in civilian life or something like that, when, of course, the average soldier on the ground understands that this is much more widespread, that this is the reality of occupation. And so that was certainly a big part of it. But I think for a lot of us returning from overseas, there was this huge disconnect that we experienced between the way that civilians sort of imagined war, what they thought we had experienced, and what we had really had experienced, the harsher, more difficult realities of war that we had experienced. And we really, a lot of us talked about how to sort of address that disconnect. And Aaron Hughes and Fernando Braga in particular were really energetically pushing the idea of doing a second Winter Soldier investigation, and I got involved with that in October of this year.
And this event is going to be the largest gathering of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. What are some of the goals of the event?
Well, it's certainly to raise public consciousness of the realities of war, to directly confront that mythology of the sort of lone individual criminal soldier, to bring soldiers like ourselves together, to sort of lift the burden of silence that a lot of us carry around with us, having experienced things or seen things that really weigh on our conscience. So, I think it runs the gamut from, our pretty explicitly political goals of trying to end the war to a much more personal, spiritual journey of healing.
Does being with other Iraq and Afghanistan veterans help you to deal with some of the stuff you've seen and dealt with?
Absolutely. Iraq Veterans Against the War, we're a community, a family, really. And I think the camaraderie and the brotherhood and sisterhood that we feel when we were, serving is certainly carried over into our activism. And there's certainly a sense of shared experience around that community that's really powerful, and I think has helped us have the courage to come forward and tell our stories, but also just to continue this fight against an immoral occupation.
You became a conscientious objector after serving 3 years in the military.
Yes.
What changed your mind about serving?
Well, when I first went to Afghanistan, I thought that we were doing the right thing. I was very motivated. I was excited to do my job as a medic. Even in the first couple of months, I felt pretty positive about the whole thing. We were doing a lot of, sort of winning the hearts and minds type of missions, humanitarian work. But once I started to see the broader picture, once I started to get a sense that we were illegally detaining, thousands and thousands of people on no charges whatsoever, merely because a tribal elder had pointed them out. Once I saw that, the results of the bombing campaign that killed over 3,000 innocent civilians. Once I realized that our presence there was having no meaningful impact on the community, we weren't contributing to the rebuilding of infrastructure at all, the medical missions that I was on was barely even a Band-Aid on a gushing wound. We were handing out 3 weeks supplies of Motrin. And then I saw the Afghan militia that we trained, that we equipped, that we advised do all sorts of horrible things, torture. And, we saw the one guy that really changed my mind was someone who had been brought in, identified as a high-ranking member of the Taliban. And he was put under guard when he came into us, and he had been hung by his hands from a tree for 3 days. And there were gangrene all the way up and down his arms and everything.
Who hung him by his hands?
The Afghan militia. And who, again, we are often, working with in an advisory capacity. And after interrogation, it turned out that he was a farmer who refused to pay taxes to the local warlord. So I suddenly realized that we were empowering the people that we were supposedly here to be liberating people from, that we were... that our occupation was basically an intervention in tribal politics that we just didn't understand. And when I saw the impact on the local population of our presence, I thought this policy seems designed to create terrorists, not to fight terrorism.
A lot of the information that's going to come out in the testimony here at Winter Soldier is going to be highly explosive. Can you tell me about the verification process you went through to make sure that these stories were accurate?
Sure. Together with Jose Vasquez, we assembled a team of about 15 combat veterans and interviewed all of our testifiers, and then took those interviews, broke it down into sort of incident reports, and then we subjected those to a more developed research process that combined legal research. We had journalists working at the Center for Constitutional Rights with us, and we had some interns and a group of veterans basically going through every single person's story to make sure that it was credible and to make sure that we could present this to the public in a way that was, had been fact-checked.
The reports in the American media often revolve around statistics or political maneuvering or military strategy, but rarely do we hear the voices and the stories of the people who actually do the fighting. Why do you think that is?
I think to some degree, there's a certain amount of willful ignorance on people's part. I think for those that supported the war to begin with, there's a certain amount of guilt associated with listening to soldiers. I think the big problem in civil-military relations is this sort of unofficial don't ask, don't tell policy, where civilians aren't pressured to ask us hard questions at all. Really, they're just told to sort of support us and to sort of glorify what we do without any sort of critical approach to it whatsoever. And for our part, we're told that what we do is secretive, that we can't expose it, that the civilian psyche can't handle the reality of war, and that we have to keep what we do to ourselves. So I think the most important part of Winter Soldier is to really directly confront that don't ask, don't tell policy. And so we're hoping that if we tell, Americans will ask more.
That unspoken don't ask, don't tell policy must feel very isolating.
Absolutely. I mean, that's sort of the personal, spiritual element of this, I think, is a much more internal journey for a lot of us, feeling like we're unburdening ourselves of things that cause a lot of guilt, because that's certainly the very personal consequence of that policy, is that soldiers are basically asked to carry this guilt around with them for the rest of their lives, to not talk about it, which is why we have so many veterans from so many wars who will never speak about their experiences, who will never both, allow Americans or citizens of whatever country they're from to understand the reality of war, and for their own part will carry it around with them.
Truth Out will be bringing you coverage of the Winter Soldier testimonials over the coming weeks. This has been Matt Renner reporting for truthout.org.